Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through complex sources so you don't have to, giving you the core insight.
And today we're tackling a really messy one, the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, often painted as just York versus Lancaster, but it's much that, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's really a century-long crisis. Governance, succession.
Yeah.
Just total instability. And you see four incredibly different kings rise and fall in pretty quick succession over about...
So our mission today is pull out the key takeaways from the sources on these four men. We're looking at Henry VI, the weak link.
Definitely the starting point. Then Edward I, the warrior king.
And the controversial one, Richard III.
Always controversial.
Yeah.
And finally, Henry VII, the man who sort of picked up the pieces and started something new.
Right. We want to understand why it was all so chaotic and how these individuals, their flaws, their ruthlessness, fundamentally shifted England's path.
Because understanding this shift, well, it's key to seeing how England moved out of that medieval Plantagenet world and into the Tudor monarchy we know.
And it really all begins with the failures of one man, Okay, let's set the scene. Henry VI, born December 1421, son of Henry V, the great hero of Agincourt, and Catherine of Valois. But the whole setup was shaky from day one, wasn't it?
Shaky is an understatement. It was catastrophically flawed. Henry V dies of dysentery in August 1422. He never even met his son, who was only 9 months old.
9 months old, King of England and technically France.
Exactly, an infant king. And despite Henry V leaving a will with provisions for governing, well, the structure just fractured almost immediately.
And those provisions for the regency, they sound like a recipe for a conflict on paper.
They absolutely were. The will named Henry V's youngest brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, as keeper of the realm, chief counselor.
But, and this is crucial, Parliament stepped in and specifically denied him full regency powers. They didn't trust him with that much control.
No, they didn't. And Gloucester, who was, ambitious, charismatic, he didn't take it well. He actually publicly tore up the plan Parliament proposed.
Really? Outright defiant?
Open defiant. It poisoned his relationship with the council for his entire life. Meanwhile, you had John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's older brother, made regent of France.
So he was busy overseas.
Mostly. He only got full powers when he was physically back in England, which wasn't that often.
And then there's the third big player, Cardinal Beaufort.
Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester. Hugely influential, immensely wealthy, a key figure on the council, and technically barred from the throne himself, being a Beaufort.
Right. So you have Gloucester and Beaufort.
Constantly at each other's throats, bitter rival, fighting over policy, money, access to the young king. It turned the court into this perpetual battleground. No stability.
And on top of this internal mess, you have the whole King of France thing, the dual coronation.
Which sounds grand, based on the Treaty of Troyes, right? Succeeded to both thrones before he could walk.
But it was a huge liability.
Massive. Because the French didn't just roll over. The Dauphin, Charles VII, contested it fiercely. He controlled central and southern France. So little Henry VI was king of two divided, warring kingdoms, while still...
So let's talk about Henry the man, or the boy, growing up. He had this incredibly demanding role waiting for him, but the sources suggest he just wasn't cut out for it.
Not temperamentally, no. He had a very rigorous upbringing, mind you. First, Lady Alice Butler was his governess. Her contract even specified she could use reasonable chastisement.
Meaning she could hit the future king?
Essentially, yes. Teach courtesy, discipline. Later, Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, not the kingmaker, the earlier one trained him in kingship, piety, martial arts. The whole package.
But the personality that came out of all that was surprisingly sensitive, almost monk.
Completely. There are accounts of him arriving in Rouen, crowds cheering wildly, and he apparently asked them to stop. Too noisy.
That doesn't sound like a medieval king.
Not at all. He was pious, gentle, but he lacked that essential core of, ruthless confidence. You needed that to manage the English nobility, who were tough, battle-hardened, used to fighting for power.
And you have to connect this lack of inner steel back to that early environment with Gloucester and Beaufort fighting over him.
Absolutely. It seems to have molded him into someone deeply dependent on others. He couldn't trust his own judgment, always needed someone to tell him what to do.
And that dependency just got worse.
Much worse. Especially later in life, with his wife, Margaret of Anjou, he relied incredibly heavily.
And this dependence, this lack of grip, it translated directly into money problems, didn't it? Financial disaster.
Oh, big time. The crown was already in debt from Henry V's wars, but Henry VI, he basically bled it dry.
How?
He was just fatally generous. The sources are full of examples. His household ballooned in size and cost. He handed out huge grants of land, titles, pensions, especially to his favorites like William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk.
Giving away the crown's income streams.
Exactly. Bankrupting the state through patronage. And it wasn't just bad judgment. It seems like a fundamental lack of understanding of administration.
The sources mention him just signing.
Willingly signing petitions that impoverished the crown and things that completely undermined local justice, like duplicate grants.
Giving the same thing to two different people.
Yes, the same lands or offices to two powerful rival nobles, like the Earl of Devon and Lord Bonville down in Cornwall. That wasn't just a paperwork mistake. It was royal indecision, sparking actual violence in the region. Law and order just crumbled.
And he undermined the justice system in other ways, too. Pardon.
Frequently, pardoning serious crimes, murder, even attempted rape, the sources are quite clear. When the king himself is seen as weak, easily manipulated, and letting criminals off, well, local justice just collapses. Nobody respects it.
This weakness then extends to foreign policy, the French situation.
Catastrophic. Henry personally favored peace, siding with Beaufort over Gloucester, who wanted to keep fighting in France. Releasing the Duke of Orleans was one controversial move.
But the big one was Maine, right?
That was the real disaster. In 1445, Henry secretly authorized ceding the province of Maine back to the French.
Secret why?
To secure a 20-year truce, and crucially, his marriage to Margaret of Anjou.
Handing over territory won by his father. That must have been hugely...
Deeply unpopular. A betrayal of Henry V's legacy. And when Gloucester found out and publicly denounced it, well, Henry VI and Suffolk had him arrested.
And Gloucester died soon after.
Died in custody, 1447. Mysteriously, many suspected foul play. It was really the first major political murder of the era, signaling Henry's regime, or rather those controlling it, would eliminate opponents.
So the stage is set for utter collapse. By 1453, England loses Normandy, loses Gascony. Henry's lack of leadership is just a constant drag.
And then, final blow, his health. August 1453, Henry suffers a complete mental breakdown.
What did that look like?
Totally catatonic, apparently. Didn't recognize anyone, couldn't speak, couldn't feed himself. Gone. A living vacuum on the throne.
And there's that fascinating family history angle. His French grandfather, Charles VI.
Charles VI of France had suffered similar bouts of madness throughout his reign. It strongly suggests some kind of inherited vulnerability, a genetic predisposition, perhaps.
Whatever the cause, the effects was immediate, wasn't it? Power vacuum.
Absolute. Henry's incapacity swung the door wide open for Richard, Duke of York. He had the strongest claim after Henry's line. In 1454, Parliament had little choice but to name York protector of the realm.
And that's the moment the gloves come off.
That's the moment. The factional struggle moves from court intrigue out into the open. Military confrontation. The Wars of the Roses proper have begun.
So if Henry VI's failure lit the fuse, it was Richard of York's son, Edward, really brought the fire.
Edward IV. He is just the total opposite of Henry VI in almost every way imaginable.
Where Henry was weak and pious.
Edward was strong, vigorous, pragmatic.
Yeah.
And ruthless when he needed.
Born in Rouen, 1440, son of Richard. Let's just quickly clarify the Yorkist claim again, because it's central to everything.
Right. It's all about Edward III's sons. Edward I was descended from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, Edward III's second surviving son. Henry VI came down from John of Gaunt, the third surviving.
So, strictly by primogeniture, firstborn line.
Edward's claim was legally superior. That was the argument Richard of York made and died for, even though Henry VI's Lancastrian line had held the throne for decades.
And Edward IV certainly looked the part of a king, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. The sources all agree. Exceptionally tall for the time, maybe 6'3" or 4", handsome, charismatic, confident, just exuding strength.
His education reflected that. More martial than academic.
Heavy focus on military training, riding, sword fighting, jousting in full plate armor. He wasn't an intellectual. Apparently preferred reading chivalric romance. But that physical presence, that warrior aura, was vital for rallying support.
And he didn't wait to inherit. He had to fight for the crown. He was involved militarily from a young age.
From about 12, fighting alongside his father. When Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, Edward, who was only 18, stepped up and took command of the Yorkist cause.
18, and he starts winning.
Key victory at Northampton in 1460, where they actually captured Henry VI. That was a huge blow to Lancastrian prestige.
Yeah.
But the really decisive battle was Towton.
1461, notorious for its brutality.
Probably the single bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Estimates vary wildly, 9,000 dead, maybe up to 28,000. Fought in a blizzard. Utter carnage.
And Edward.
A crushing Yorkist victory. That win, by right of conquest, really cemented his claim and put him firmly on the throne.
Now, Edward's first reign, 1461 to 1470, this is where we see some real shifts, especially in how he managed money. It sounds quite...
This is a really crucial point. Medieval kings usually relied on the exchequer system for finances. Slow, bureaucratic, very accountable to Parliament. Edward largely bypassed.
How did he do that? The chamber.
Exactly. He basically ran the royal finances, like his own private ducal estate, which he had experience doing. He appointed his own trusted stewards to collect revenues, rents, customs, fines, and they paid it directly into his personal household accounts, the chamber.
Cutting out the middleman in Parliament?
Pretty much. It gave him immediate private access to cash. He could act quickly without waiting for Parliament to grant tax. He even started investing his own money in businesses' wool trade, tin mining. First king to really do that.
Did it work? Did he fix the debt?
He made progress. He definitely chipped away at the massive debt left by Henry VI. Financial stability was key to keeping power without constantly asking Parliament for unpopular taxes.
But he wasn't exactly frugal himself, was he? The image of magnificence.
No, he spent lavishly. Jewels, clothes, palaces, feasting. It was calculated, though, projecting this image of a splendid, wealthy, powerful warrior king, a deliberate contrast to the rather shabby image of Henry VI's court.
So good PR, but maybe not great for the long-term treasury balance.
Exactly. The image worked politically, but the high spending meant that when he died, the treasury wasn't massively better off than when he started, despite his improved system.
And what about justice under Edward?
He was active, sat in on the court of King's Bench sometimes, tried to project authority, but realistically, local control still depended heavily on his personal relationships with powerful nobles and their loyalty. It was fragile.
And his personal life wasn't exactly a model of discipline either. The mistresses.
Famously numerous affairs, mistresses like Jane Shore, Lady Elizabeth Lucy, had illegitimate children. It added to his image as this vigorous, masculine king, I suppose.
But maybe hinted at an impulsive side, a lack of control that could spill into politics.
And it absolutely did, which leads us straight into the biggest crisis of his first reign, the falling out with the Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, the kingmaker.
Warwick had been instrumental in putting Edward on the throne, hadn't he?
Hugely instrumental, the most powerful nobleman in England. Edward rewarded him massively with titles and land. But Warwick didn't just want rewards. He expected to basically run the government, to control the king he'd made.
And Edward wasn't having that.
Not in the long run. The breaking point was the marriage issue in 1464.
Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville.
Yes, secret, impulsive, and politically disastrous from Warwick's point of view. Elizabeth was a widow, technically from a Lancastrian family, relatively low-born nobility, and already had 2 sons.
And Warwick was busy trying to arrange a big diplomatic match for Edward.
He was deep in negotiations for a prestigious marriage alliance with the French royal family. Edward marrying Elizabeth Woodville completely undercut him, humiliated him publicly.
And then came the rise of the Woodville.
Edward started promoting Elizabeth's huge family, brothers, sisters, cousins, showering them with titles, lands, and marrying them off to wealthy heirs.
Which annoyed the established Yorkist nobles.
Annoyed them. It infuriated them, especially Warwick. He saw his own power and influence being deliberately sidelined by this new, grasping Woodville faction around the king.
So Warwick felt pushed out. What did he do?
He started plotting, conspired with Edward's own unstable, envious younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence.
Clarence. Why would he betray Edward?
Ambition, resentment. Warwick fed it. They spread rumors that Edward himself was illegitimate, a devastating charge, and they sealed their pact by marrying Clarence to Warwick's elder daughter, Isabel.
This led to actual fighting.
Yes. Warwick and Clarence raised troops. They defeated royal forces at Edgecote Moor in 1469, and incredibly, they captured King Edward IV.
Warwick captured the king he made.
He did. But trying to rule with the king as a prisoner didn't work. He couldn't get enough support, especially for putting Clarence forward. He was forced to release Edward.
But the damage was done. Trust broken.
Completely. In 1470, after another failed rebellion, Warwick and Clarence fled England, and then they did the unthinkable.
They went to France and allied with Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI Queen.
The sworn enemy. It was an absolutely stunning political U-turn. They agreed to restore Henry VI to the throne. They invaded England. Edward's support crumbled, and Henry VI was briefly put back on the throne. The redemption.
And Edward
had to flee, escaped to Burgundy, his brother-in-law's territory. His pregnant wife, Elizabeth Woodville, took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. It looked like it was all over for him.
But Edward came back. And the second phase, from 1471, he seems different, harder.
Definitely. That exile clearly hardened him. He wasn't just the charismatic charmer anymore. He was utterly ruthless when he returned.
The Lancastrian Restoration didn't last long then.
Barely 6 months. Edward landed back in England in 1471 with his loyal brother Richard, the future Richard III, and incredibly reconciled with the ever-fickle Clarence.
Clarence switched sides again.
He did. Abandoned Warwick. Edward then moved incredibly fast, securing 2 crushing victories in quick succession.
Barnet first.
Battle of Barnet. Warwick, the great kingmaker, was caught in the fog and killed. End of an era right there.
And then Tewkesbury.
Just weeks later, Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret of Anjou's forces were routed, and crucially, her son, Prince Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir, was killed in the battle, or possibly afterwards.
The only heir apparent to die in battle on English.
That's right. It effectively wiped out the direct Lancastrian male line.
But not quite the final act of elimination.
No. That same night, as Edward I re-entered London in triumph, Henry VI was killed in the Tower of London.
Murdered.
Almost certainly. Yeah. A sharp blow to the head, according to the remains found later. Very likely on Edward's direct orders. He was taking absolutely no chances this time. The Lancastrian threat, in terms of claimants, was finally extinct.
So Edward's second reign, 1471 onwards, is more stable.
Much more stable in turn. And he showed that pragmatic streak again, especially with France. He launched an invasion in 1475, but quickly ended it with the Treaty of Picquigny,
which involved getting money from the French king.
A lot of money. A huge annual pension paid directly to Edward by Louis XI of France. Some English knights grumbled it was cowardly not to fight, but financially, it was brilliant. It meant Edward didn't need to ask Parliament for war taxes again. More financial independence.
But there was one last internal loose end, brother.
George, Duke of Clarence. He just couldn't stop causing trouble. Started reviving those old rumors about Edward's illegitimacy.
Edward had finally had enough.
Completely. No more forgiveness. Edward personally presided over Clarence's trial for treason in Parliament in 1478. The outcome was never really in doubt.
Execution. And the famous story.
Execution in the Tower, which led to the persistent rumor, probably just a story, that he was drowned in a butt of his favorite Malmsey wine. Whether true or not, the message was crystal clear. Disloyalty, even from family, meant death.
Edward I's reign, despite the turmoil, cured by the end. Then he dies suddenly. April 14, only 40 years.
Yeah, apparently of illness, though the exact cause is debated. But his sudden death completely destabilized everything again, and it thrust his youngest surviving brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, into the center stage.
Richard III. His reign is short, only 2 years, but probably one of the most debated in English history.
Absolutely. Defined by competence on one hand and utter infamy on the other.
Let's look at Richard before 1483. He was born 1452, loyal to Edward.
Intensely loyal throughout Edward's reign. Fought bravely for him at Barnet and Tewkesbury. He was a proven, capable military commander.
And he had a power base of his own, didn't he, in the north?
Yes, this is really important for understanding. Edward had made him head of the Council of the North, and the sources suggest he was actually a very effective just governor there. He brought stability, promoted local northern lords, and seems to have been genuinely popular in the region.
So, seen as capable, loyal, effective, at least before Edward's death.
Yeah.
He also married Anne Neville.
He did. Warwick, the kingmaker's younger daughter. And interestingly, the widow of that Lancastrian Prince Edward killed at Tewkesbury. That marriage caused a bitter dispute with his brother Clarence over the vast Warwick inheritance, by the way.
Okay, so Edward V died. His son, Edward V, is only 12 years old. Richard is named Lord Protector in Edward's will. What happens next?
Richard moves incredibly and decisive. The Woodvilles, the Queen Mother Elizabeth family, were trying to consolidate their own power fast, maybe even sideline Richard.
So Richard intercepted the young king.
Intercepted Edward V and his Woodville escort, led by Earl Rivers, the Queen's brother, at Stony Stratford. Richard arrested Rivers. And crucially, he also arrested Lord Hastings.
But he was a staunch Yorkist, loyal to Edward V, and supposedly friendly with Richard.
Exactly. Arresting Hastings and later executing him without trial was the real shockwave. It showed Richard wasn't just acting as protector against the Woodvilles, he was eliminating anyone who might oppose a bigger move. It signaled a coup was underway.
He secures Edward V and later his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their safety.
But very quickly became clear it was imprisoned. Richard needed a justification to take the throne himself. He couldn't just rely on force. He needed a legal pretext, however flimsy.
And this is where the pre-contract story comes in.
Yes. Suddenly, a clergyman, Robert Stilling, Bishop of Bath and Wells, is the name usually cited, comes forward. He claims that Edward V, before marrying Elizabeth Woodville, had already entered into a legally binding pre-contract of marriage with another woman, Lady Eleanor Talbot.
Why did a pre-contract matter so much?
Because under canon law at the time, a valid pre-contract was considered as binding as a marriage. If Edward V was already effectively married to Eleanor Talbot when he married Elizabeth Woodville,
then his marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, bigamous.
Exactly. And if the marriage was invalid, then all the children from that marriage, including Edward V and his brother Richard, were illegitimate. And
illegitimate children couldn't inherit the throne.
Precisely. It was the legal mechanism, however dubious the evidence for the pre-contract actually was, to disinherit Edward V's sons and clear the way for Richard himself as the next legitimate heir.
So a sermon is preached declaring the princes illegitimate. A carefully orchestrated petition asks Richard to take the throne,
which he, after some feigned reluctance, agreed to on June 26, 1483. He was crowned Richard III on July 6. Parliament later ratified all this with the Act Titulus Regis in early 1484, formally setting out the pre-contract story. But his entire claim rested on that contested assertion.
Which leads directly to the darkest cloud over his reign, the princes in the Tower.
The two boys, Edward V, aged 12, and Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, aged 9 or 10, they were seen playing in the Tower grounds in the summer of 1483, and then they just disappeared.
And Richard III never produced them again, never explained what happened.
Never. That silence was politically ruinous. It allowed suspicion and rumor to fester. The overwhelming belief, then and now, was that he had them murdered to secure his throne. His failure to address it publicly basically cemented that narrative.
What did the contemporary or near contemporaries say, though we have to remember the Tudor bias later on?
Right, Tudor sources are definitely hostile. Dominic Mancini, an Italian visitor in London in 1483, wrote shortly after that Richard was responsible, based on London rumors. Later, Sir Thomas More, writing under Henry VIII, famously claimed that Richard ordered Sir James Tyrrell to carry out the murder, smothering the boys with pillows.
Are there anyone else?
Oh, theories abound. Some have pointed the finger at the Duke of Buckingham, who rebelled against Richard shortly after and also had a distant claim to the throne. Others even suggested Henry II might have done it later, though it seems unlikely he destroyed proof of Richard's guilt if he found the boys alive. But the key point isn't who did it definitively, but the political consequence of their disappearance.
What was that consequence?
It galvanized opposition. It horrified many people, even Yorkist loyalists. Crucially, it drove the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville, previously Richard's enemy, into a secret alliance with Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother. They agreed their children, Elizabeth of York and Henry Tudor, would marry if Henry successfully took the throne. That unified the opposition.
It's fascinating, though, that despite this incredibly dark cloud, Richard's short reign actually saw some positive reform. It's a contradictory picture.
It really is. He seems to have genuinely tried to govern well, drawing on that experience in the North. One really significant act was abolishing the benevolence.
What was that exactly?
It was essentially a forced loan demanded by the king, often from wealthy merchants or nobles, without parliamentary consent. Edward IV had used it. It was deeply resented, basically arbitrary taxation. Abolishing it was a very popular move.
It's trying to win support.
He also brought in laws to protect people against seizure of their property before conviction, sped up the justice system, and quite remarkably set up a sort of early legal aid system, the Court of Request, specifically for poor people who couldn't afford lawyers. He even ordered laws to be translated into English.
So signs of a potentially just and effective ruler, completely overshadowed by the usurpation and the prince.
That's the paradox of Richard III. But his position was always precarious. He lacked widespread southern support and relied heavily on his northern allies, which caused resentment elsewhere, and fate seemed to conspire against.
The Buckingham Rebellion in late 1480
failed, partly because Henry Tudor's supporting invasion fleet was scattered by storm. Buckingham was captured and executed, but it showed how fragile Richard's hold was.
And then personal tragedy struck.
A huge blow. In 1484, his only legitimate son and heir, Edward of Middleham, died suddenly. For many contemporaries, this looked like divine judgment for the prince's death. He left Richard without a clear successor.
And then his wife, Anne Neville, died in early 1485.
Yes. And immediately, rumors started swirling, possibly put about by his enemies, possibly based on something that Richard planned to marry his own niece, Edward V's daughter, Elizabeth of York.
The very woman pledged to Henry Tudor.
Exact. Whether Richard seriously considered it or not, the rumor itself was damning. It threatened to break that crucial Woodville-Tudor alliance that was backing Henry's claim. It made Henry's invasion seem more urgent.
Which brings us to August 1485. Bosworth.
Henry Tudor lands in Wales, gathers support, marches in. Richard musters his forces to meet him near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard probably had the large army, maybe 7,500 to 12,000 against Henry's 5,000 to 8,000. On paper, Richard should have won.
But there was a wild card, wasn't there? The Stanleys.
Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley, hugely powerful nobles. Thomas Stanley was Henry Tudor's stepfather, but Richard held Stanley's son hostage to ensure loyalty. The Stanleys brought thousands of men to the field, but positioned them off to the side. They refused to commit either way.
Playing a waiting game.
Exactly. Watching to see who looked like winning. Richard saw his northern troops under Northumberland also failing to fully engage. His position was becoming desperate.
And then Richard does something extraordinary.
He spots Henry Tudor's banner across the battle, relatively lightly guarded. In a moment of sheer desperation, Richard decides to gamble everything on a direct cavalry charge straight at Henry himself.
A kill or be killed charge.
Absolutely. A final, almost medieval act of personal combat leadership. He charged, killed Henry's standard bearer, Sir William Brandon, and apparently got within sword's length of Henry.
Incredible. What stopped him?
Sir William Stanley finally made his move. Seeing Richard committed and potentially about to win, Stanley ordered his troops to intervene against Richard.
The final betrayal.
It was. Richard was surrounded, pulled from his horse, vastly outnumbered. But the accounts say he refused surrender and died fighting manfully. Later examination of his skeleton showed he suffered multiple head wounds, 9 severe ones. He was the last English king to die in battle.
And the crown.
Famously, according to legend, found hanging on a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head right there on the battlefield. The Plantagenet dynasty ended in the mud of Bosworth.
So, Henry Tudor becomes King Henry VII, but he must have known his claim to the throne was shaky, to say the least.
Incredibly shaky. Probably the weakest claim of any successful English monarch ever. Break it down. His claim came entirely through his mother, Margaret Beaufort.
And her line.
She was descended from John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son, but through Gaunt's liaison with Catherine Swynford. Their children, the Beauforts, were born illegitimate, though later legitimized by Parliament.
But there was a catch, wasn't there?
A huge catch. When Henry IV, John of Gaunt's legitimate son, confirmed their legitimization, he specifically added a clause explicitly barring the Beaufort line from ever inheriting the throne. So, legally, Henry Tudor had no right whatsoever.
And his life before Bosworth wasn't exactly kingly training.
Not at all. His father, Edmund Tudor, died before he was born. He was raised by his uncle, Jasper. After the Yorkists won at Tewkesbury in 1471, the 14-year-old Henry had to flee for his life.
To Brittany.
Yes. Spent 14 years in exile in Brittany and France, basically as a political pawn, constantly under threat of being extradited back to England by Edward IV or Richard III. He lived on edge, learning cunning and con.
So Bosworth wasn't just a victory, it was almost a miracle for him, and purely down to the Stanleys switching sides at the last.
Absolutely. He knew his position was incredibly fragile, which is why his first moves as king are just masterclasses in shrewd political maneuver.
Like backdating the start of his reign.
Utterly brilliant and ruthless. He was crowned in October 1485, but he officially declared his reign began on August 21st, 1485, the day before the Battle of Bosworth.
What did that achieve?
It meant anyone who fought for King Richard III at Bosworth was now legally defined as a traitor fighting against the rightful king, Henry VII. It gave him immediate legal grounds to execute opponents and, more importantly, confiscate their lands and wealth through acts of attainder, coldly efficient.
And the second big move, the marriage.
Marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward V's eldest daughter, in January 1486. This fulfilled the promise made by his mother and Elizabeth Woodville, uniting the houses of Lancaster, what little was left of it in him, and York.
The Tudor rose symbol.
Exactly. Symbolically crucial. But notice the timing. He was crowned first in his own right, then he married her. He made sure his claim wasn't seen as dependent on his wife's superior Yorkist lineage. He ruled by conquest and providence as he saw it, not just marriage.
But uniting the symbols didn't end the threats, did it? The Yorkists weren't finished.
Not by a long shot. His reign was plagued by plots and pretenders trying to replace. The first major one was Lambert Simnel in 1487.
Who did Simnel claim to be?
He was coached to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence, who Richard III had imprisoned, but Henry II kept locked up. Simnel gained significant support, especially in Ireland, and even had backers among disgruntled Yorkist nobles, like the Earl of Lincoln.
How did Henry handle that?
Militarily, he defeated Simnel's forces decisively at the Battle of Stokefeet, and then showed remarkable pragmatism. He knew Simnel was just a boy, a pawn. Instead of executing him, Henry pardoned him and gave him a job in the royal kitchen.
From claimant king to kitchen boy. That sends a message.
It does. Disarmed the threat through ridicule almost. But the next one was far more serious. Perkin Warbeck.
Warbeck claimed.
Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the princes in the Tower. This was much more dangerous because, unlike Warwick, who Henry could produce alive from the Tower, the fate of the younger prince was unknown. If Warbeck was him, it implied Richard III might have been innocent, undermining Henry's legitimacy.
And Warbeck got foreign support.
Significant foreign support. Margaret of Burgundy, Edward I's sister, backed him strong. James I of Scotland supported him for a time. He was a thorn in Henry's side for years, launching several invasion attempts.
And dealing with Warbeck cost Henry money, right, leading to unrest.
Yes. To fund defenses against Warbeck and Scottish incursions, Henry had to raise taxes. This led directly to the Cornish Rebellion in 1497, ordinary people protesting the financial burden. It showed Henry that stability wasn't just about defeating rivals. It was about managing the kingdom effectively.
What happened to Warbeck?
He was finally captured in 1497. Henry initially treated him leniently, keeping him at court. But Warbeck tried to escape, allegedly plotted with the real Earl of Warwick still in the Tower. Henry had had enough. Warbeck confessed publicly to being an impostor from Flanders, and both he and Warwick were executed in 1499.
Eliminating the last serious Yorkist threat.
Pretty much. And these constant challenges seem to have convinced Henry VII of something fundamental. He concluded that the entire Wars of the Roses, all that chaos, stemmed from two core problems. Nobles who were too powerful and independent over mighty subjects, and a crown that was too poor and reliant on Parliament.
And he set out to fix both. This is where his reputation for being, well, rather grasping credit.
Exactly. This is the shift towards a stronger, more centralized, almost absolutist style of monarch. He seems to have been influenced by the writings of Sir John Fortescue, who argued that English kings needed their own independent wealth to avoid being controlled by Parliament nobility.
So how did Henry build up this wealth and control?
Several ways. First, sheer thrift. He drastically cut court spending, made access to him much harder. He was famously careful with money.
But it wasn't just saving pennies, was it? He actively extracted money from the nobility.
Oh yes, ruthlessly. He employed notoriously harsh administrators. Empson and Dudley became infamous for this. Their job was to dig up old, long-forgotten laws and feudal obligations and enforce them strictly, levying massive fines on the nobility for any infringement.
Things like livery and maintenance, keeping private army.
That was a key target. Henry cracked down hard on nobles, keeping large retinues of armed followers, using heavy fines collected through legal instruments called bonds and recognizances.
What were those?
Essentially, huge suspended fine. A nobleman would be forced to agree to owe the crown an enormous sum, payable only if he broke certain conditions like not raising troops without permission. It was financial blackmail designed to keep them terrified and loyal, and it poured money into Henry's coffers.
And he used a special court for this, not the regular court.
He used specialist parts of his council, most notably the infamous council learned in the law. This wasn't a court of law in the traditional sense. It operated more secretly, outside the common law system, specifically to enforce the king's financial right and collect these debts and fines directly. It was efficient, deeply unpopular, and feared.
But it worked financially.
Spectacular. The crown became incredibly wealthy, financially self-sufficient for the first time in generations.
Which meant he didn't need Parliament much.
Hardly at all, because he didn't need them to grant him taxes nearly as often. Between 1497 and his death in 1509, Parliament only met once. Brief. He was effectively ruling without constant reference to the representatives of the realm. A huge shift in power.
So stability achieved, finances secured. He also focused on securing the dynasty through marriage.
Absolutely. The crowning diplomatic achievement was marrying his eldest son and heir, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, in 1501.
A huge boost to Tudor legitimacy on the Europe.
Massive. But then, disaster. Just 6 months later, in 1502, Prince Arthur died suddenly, possibly of sweating sickness.
Leaving the succession uncertain again, and more personal tragedy followed.
Yes, the following year, 1503, Henry's wife, Elizabeth of York, died after complications from childbirth. Sources suggest Henry, who had perhaps grown genuinely fond of her, despite the political nature of the marriage, was devastated. He became more withdrawn, more suspicious.
So the focus shifted to his second son.
To the young Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII. Securing the dynasty now rested on him, and Henry VIII immediately started complex negotiations to get a papal dispensation, allowing young Henry to marry his brother Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon.
Why was that so important to keep the Spanish alliance?
Keep the alliance, and crucially, keep Catherine's very large dowry, which would have had to be returned if she went back to Spain. It was pure political and financial pragmatism.
These later years, Henry VIII gets this reputation as the Winter King.
Yes. Harder, more avaricious, more isolated, increasingly reliant on those feared financial men. He wasn't a popular king, unloved, but respected, or perhaps feared.
While his son, Prince Henry,
Was everything Henry VII wasn't, publicly at least. Young, handsome, athletic, cheerful, seemingly generous. The populace looked forward to him as a welcome change from his austere father, the perfect setup for Henry VIII's image.
Henry VII finally died in April 1509, ruled for nearly 24 years.
He did, age 52. Apparently, his death was kept secret for 2 days by his closest advisors, Empson and Dudley included, just to ensure an absolutely smooth, uncontested transition to Henry VIII. No last-minute chances for trouble.
So looking back, how do we assess Henry VII? Resented, autocratic, successful.
Undeniably successful in his primary goal, ending the dynastic instability. He brought peace and, crucially, solvency after decades of civil war. He correctly diagnosed the root causes: weak central government, lack of funds, overmighty nobles, and ruthlessly dedicated his entire reign to fixing those structural problems, whatever the cost to his popularity. Hashtag, outro, expert speaker. So, when you look back at these 4 kings, quite an arc, isn't it?
A really dramatic sweep. You start with Henry VI, pious, well-meaning perhaps, but disastrous, creating the vacuum.
Then Edward I bursts in charismatic, militarily brilliant, but maybe too impulsive, his reign fractured by personal choices and betrayal.
Followed by Richard III, competent in many ways, especially as a governor, but ultimately consumed by the ruthless ambition, need a crown, and forever tainted by that act.
And finally, Henry VII. The outsider, the exile, the man with the weakest claim who wins through luck and cunning and then spends 24 years methodically, paranoidically almost, building a stable, solvent, cured dynasty.
It really highlights how trapped they all were in this brutal cycle, doesn't it? Where lineage wasn't enough, where personal character weakness, strength, ruthlessness was constantly tested by this lackluster, undisputed succession.
And the level of sheer political violence is staggering. When Gloucester, Henry VI himself, his son Prince Edward, Clarence, Hastings, Rivers, the princes in the Tower, Buckingham, Richard III's survival, demanded a level of ruthlessness that Henry VII, perhaps learning from all the failures before him, perfect.
He figured out that charisma like Edward V's or military skill like Richard III's wasn't the it was control. financial control, legal control, fear.
His entire reign was a direct reaction against the chaos of the Wars of the Rose. He delivered peace, stability, the foundation for the whole Tudor century. But as you said, he was unloved. He governed through mechanisms like the Council learned, which were seen as instruments of tyranny and extortion.
Which really leaves us with a fascinating question to ponder, doesn't it? Henry VIII was cold, calculating, probably greedy, certainly autocratic, yet undeniably successful in ending decades of civil war and establishing a lasting.
So does that suggest that in times of deep crisis, maybe the most effective leaders aren't the popular ones or the traditional ones, but the ones laser-focused on stability and solvency, even if it means ruling through fear and bending the rule? Is a ruthlessly managed treasury the ultimate foundation for peace?
Something for you to think about. Join us next time for another deep dive.